The pen didn't shake. That was the part that broke her. Veronica Ashford had imagined this moment 100 times over the past 3 weeks. The trembling hands, the tears she'd have to blink back, the dramatic pause before she finally let go. But when the lawyer slid the papers across the mahogany table and her husband sat across from her, without even looking up from his phone, her hand was completely still. She signed her name in one clean, unbroken line. Veronica Ashford, soon to be Veronica Marsh again. And then it was done. 14 years. Gone in 11 seconds. Elliot didn't acknowledge it. He was already reaching for his own copy. Already nodding at his lawyer. Already checking the time on his watch. That same brushed gold Patek Philippe he'd bought himself the year she miscarried their first pregnancy, and he'd spent the week in Vancouver at a strategy retreat. She'd found out about the retreat 3 months ago. It hadn't been about strategy. It had been about Cassandra Vane, 31 years old, junior portfolio manager at Elliot's firm. The kind of woman who wore silk blouses on casual Fridays and called Veronica's husband by a nickname Veronica had never heard him use. "We're done here," Elliot's lawyer said, collecting papers. Veronica's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, touched her arm gently. "Take your time." She didn't need time. She stood, buttoned her coat, and walked out of the conference room on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Toronto without saying a single word to the man she'd loved since she was 26 years old. She made it to the elevator before her legs stopped working properly. The apartment she moved into was in Leslieville, a 2-bedroom she found through a colleague whose sister was relocating to Vancouver. It was nothing like the house in Rosedale. No crown molding, no heated floors, no back garden where she'd planted peonies every spring. The kitchen window looked out onto a fire escape and someone's collection of terracotta pots. She told herself it had character. She told herself she liked it. What she didn't tell anyone was that she ate dinner standing at that kitchen window every night for the first 2 weeks, because sitting at a table for one felt like something she wasn't ready to admit yet. Her sister called every other day. Her mother called every day, which was worse, because her mother's version of comfort was a rotating series of observations like, "You always work too much," and "I never understood what you saw in a man who irons his own shirts." Veronica was 39 years old, newly divorced, and working as a senior urban planner for the city of Toronto. She had a good life, by most measurements. She had work she believed in, friends who showed up with wine and takeout, a body that was healthy. She kept reminding herself of these things the way you press on a bruise to check if it still hurts. It always still hurt. And then, 6 weeks after she signed those papers, she found out she was pregnant. She had taken the test on a Tuesday morning before work. Mostly because her cycle had been off, and she'd assumed it was stress. She'd bought the test almost as an afterthought, tucked between a box of crackers and some Tylenol at the Shoppers on Queen Street. She hadn't even sat down. She'd just set it on the bathroom counter and gone to brush her teeth, and when she turned back around and saw those 2 lines, she actually laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind of laugh that's really the sound a person makes when their brain short-circuits. She sat down on the cold bathroom tile and stayed there for a very long time. The math was uncomfortable but clear. She and Elliot had made one last, desperate attempt at reconciliation in late October, the kind of evening that happens between people who have been together long enough to mistake familiarity for hope. She hadn't thought anything of it afterward. She'd filed it away as a mistake, the way you do, and moved on. Now she sat on bathroom tile in a Leslieville apartment and wondered what moved on was supposed to mean anymore. She didn't tell anyone for 3 weeks. She went to her first appointment alone, told the receptionist she was there for a routine checkup, and sat in the waiting room surrounded by women in various stages of pregnancy, who all seemed to have someone with them. She watched a man rub his wife's back while she filled out forms and looked away before she started crying in public. She was not going to cry in public. She called Elliot on a Thursday evening, sitting in her car outside the apartment, because she didn't want the walls of the place to absorb this conversation. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Ronnie. His voice was careful. That carefulness told her everything. He'd already been coached by someone, maybe his lawyer, maybe Cassandra, to be careful with her. She said it plainly. She wasn't pregnant with a question. She was pregnant with a fact. She told him and she waited. There was a pause that lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted. "I think," he said slowly, "we should talk about what makes sense, given everything." What makes sense? As if a pregnancy were a project deliverable. As if she were one of his junior analysts presenting options for a board meeting. "I'm keeping it," she said. "I'm not calling to negotiate. I'm calling because you have a right to know." Another pause. "Ronnie, don't," she said it quietly. "Don't say whatever you're about to say." She hung up. She sat in the car for another 20 minutes, watching a couple walk past on the sidewalk. Their dog pulling ahead on a leash, the woman laughing at something the man said. Simple and ordinary and impossible seeming. Then she went upstairs and made herself dinner and ate it standing at the window, like always. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing from her kitchen window in Leslieville, was that Elliot's careful, constructed world was already beginning to come apart. The investigation had started before the divorce. A former colleague of Elliot's, a man named Werner who'd been quietly pushed out of the firm 2 years earlier, had been cooperating with securities regulators for months. The story that emerged, slowly and then all at once the way these things always do, was not flattering. Elliot hadn't embezzled exactly. The lawyers would spend considerable time arguing about language. But he had participated in a scheme that misrepresented the value of certain real estate investment portfolios to attract institutional capital. The kind of thing that looks like ambition until a regulator decides to look more carefully, at which point it looks like fraud. Veronica read about it first in the Globe and Mail on a Saturday morning, sitting at her kitchen table with coffee because she'd finally made herself sit at the table like a person. She read the article twice. She felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just a deep, exhausted sadness. She had loved that man. She had built a life around him. And here was his name in a national newspaper, connected to words like misrepresentation and regulatory breach, an ongoing investigation. She thought about the house in Rosedale. She thought about 14 years. She turned the page. She was 22 weeks along when she met Owen. She hadn't gone to the community consultation meeting, expecting anything other than a long evening in a church basement in the annex, fielding questions from residents who were upset about a proposed transit corridor. She'd run dozens of these meetings. She knew how to manage them. Stay calm, stay factual, validate without conceding, redirect. What she hadn't planned for was the man who waited until everyone else had filed out to approach the table where she was packing up her materials. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing a jacket that had seen better days and carrying a folder of printouts that looked like he'd done significant research. "Owen Hartley," he said, extending his hand. "I'm on the Residents Association board. I just wanted to say, you handled that really well." That guy in the third row was genuinely difficult. She shook his hand. He had concerns about property values. He was rude about them. People are passionate about their neighborhoods. He smiled at that. It was an honest smile, not a charming one. There's a difference. And at 39, Veronica had finally learned to tell them apart. "Can I ask you something? Off the record, or whatever the equivalent is at a community meeting." "Sure. Do you actually believe in this corridor? Or is it just a project you've been assigned?" She looked at him. Most people at these meetings treated her like a bureaucratic obstacle. This man was asking if she had convictions. "I believe in it," she said. "The data on transit density is clear. The neighborhood will benefit. It'll be disruptive for 2 years and better for the next 40. He nodded, considering this. "That's what I needed to hear." He picked up his folder. "Thank you, Miss Marsh," she said. "Veronica Marsh." He paused briefly at something in her voice. She wasn't sure what he heard there. "Thank you, Veronica." She watched him go, and then she finished packing her materials, and she drove home, and she thought about the way he'd asked the question, "Do you actually believe in it?" Like her answer actually mattered. She thought about that for longer than made sense. She was 26 weeks when her lawyer called with news about the divorce settlement. There was a complication. "The parental rights clause," Patricia said carefully. "We need to talk about it." Veronica put down the cup she was holding. "What about it?" "When you signed the final documents, there was an addendum. Page 11, subsection 4. It was presented as standard dissolution language. It wasn't, Patricia." Her voice came out very flat. "Tell me plainly." What Patricia told her was this. buried in the final pages of the divorce agreement, in language that her lawyer had flagged, only now after Elliot's legal team had made reference to it in a preliminary custody communication, was a clause that significantly restricted Veronica's ability to establish sole custody. It hadn't been there in the draft she'd reviewed. It had appeared in the final signed version. Someone had altered the document. "That's not possible," Veronica said, even as she knew it was entirely possible, because she was an adult woman who understood that things that shouldn't be possible happen to women in the middle of divorce proceedings all the time. "We're looking into how it happened," Patricia said. "But Veronica, I need you to understand that this doesn't affect the pregnancy. He doesn't have rights to a child that wasn't disclosed at the time of signing. He knows about the pregnancy. I told him." A pause. "Okay, that changes things slightly. We'll need to get ahead of this." She hung up and stood in her kitchen with her hands pressed flat against the counter, feeling the baby move, a rolling, tumbling sensation she still wasn't used to, and she breathed. She breathed, and she thought, and then she called Patricia back and said, "Tell me what we need to do." She didn't tell Owen about the clause. She barely knew Owen. They'd had coffee twice since the meeting in the church basement. He'd reached out through the Residents Association contact form, which she'd found oddly touching, that he'd used the official channel rather than just showing up, and what they had could not yet be called anything with a name. He made her laugh. He asked her questions and then listened to the answers. He brought her a book about urban infrastructure once, which she had mentioned in passing she'd been meaning to read, and he'd left it with the receptionist at her office because he wasn't sure if dropping by was appropriate. She'd found the note tucked inside. "Chapter 7 is the most useful one, I think. Though I'm probably biased." Owen. She'd read Chapter 7 twice. She told herself it was nothing. She was pregnant and newly divorced, and not in a position to want anything from anyone. But she kept finding herself thinking about the honest smile, the way he'd asked if she actually believed in what she was doing. It felt like being seen. It felt like something she'd forgotten was possible. He found out about the pregnancy the way she'd been dreading. He saw her in the parking lot of a grocery store on a Sunday, her coat unable to fully close over her belly, and for a brief moment she watched his face do something complicated before he arranged it back into warmth. "Veronica." He came over. "Pregnant," she said, "because what else was there? I can see that." A beat. "Do you want to? I mean, is this something you want to talk about? Or, it's my ex-husband's," she said. "We were already separated when I found out. It's complicated." "Okay," he said. Just that. Not oh or wow or any of the awkward responses she'd been bracing for. "Okay," she said. "Yes." He picked up one of her grocery bags without asking. "Okay. Do you want company walking to your car?" She did. She very much did. Elliot made his move at 31 weeks. His lawyer contacted Patricia with a document. A formal declaration of parental interest, citing the clause buried in the divorce papers, requesting mediation and the establishment of a co-parenting framework in advance of the birth. It was, Patricia explained, legally aggressive but not unexpected. What was unexpected was the allegation attached, that Veronica had concealed the pregnancy during the divorce proceedings in order to deny Elliot his parental rights. "He's claiming I hid it," she said. "Yes. I didn't know I was pregnant when we signed. I know that. We can prove it. But he's positioning himself as a victim here, and we need to be prepared for the narrative." The narrative. Her pregnancy had become a narrative. Her body, her child, her future. A narrative that Elliot's team was already spinning in their favor. She sat in Patricia's office with her hands in her lap, and her jaw set, and thought about all the times over 14 years she had quietly adjusted herself to make room for Elliot's comfort. All the times she'd softened her voice, chosen smaller words, made herself take up less space so he'd feel like more. And now, even here, even in this, the most intimate and fundamental thing she'd ever experienced, he was the story. Not anymore. "What do we need?" she asked. Patricia told her. Documentation, witnesses, medical records, a timeline that was airtight. They needed to establish that Veronica had disclosed the pregnancy to Elliot voluntarily before he had any legal basis to demand disclosure. They needed to demonstrate that the clause in the divorce papers had been inserted without her knowledge or consent. "And the person who inserted it?" Veronica asked. Patricia hesitated. "That's a separate investigation. We've flagged it to the Law Society. I want to know who did it. Veronica, I want to know. She said it quietly and meant it completely. It took 6 weeks, 2 investigators, and a forensic document examiner, but eventually they found Werner. Not Werner from the securities investigation, a different Werner. Werner Blackwood, a junior associate at Elliot's previous law firm, who had left abruptly 18 months ago and who, it turned out, had a connection to Cassandra Vane that went back several years before Cassandra joined Elliot's firm. What exactly he had been asked to do, and by whom, was a question that would be answered in a courtroom eventually, but the shape of it was becoming clear. The clause had been inserted deliberately, the paperwork exchanged at the last moment, and the goal had been to give Elliot leverage over any future custody dispute. He had known she might be pregnant, or suspected, or prepared for the possibility. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the man she'd married at 26, standing in a garden in Prince Edward County, with the sun going sideways over the vineyards. She thought about who he'd been then, and who he'd become, and whether those were actually 2 different people, or just 2 stages of the same one. She decided it didn't matter anymore. She was 37 weeks when Owen asked if he could be there. They were sitting in her apartment, eating Thai food she'd ordered because cooking required standing for long periods, and her back had opinions about that now. He'd come over to help her put together a crib he'd offered to assemble, and they'd gotten through most of it before stopping for dinner, and now the crib stood mostly finished in the second bedroom, and she was eating pad see-ew off a paper plate. And somehow this was the most comfortable she'd felt in a year. "I've been thinking," he said carefully. He was the kind of man who said things carefully, because he meant them carefully. She'd come to recognize it, to value it in a way she couldn't have articulated to anyone who hadn't spent years with a man who said things carelessly. "When the baby comes, I don't want to push you, and I understand if the answer is no, and this doesn't have to mean anything in particular." "Owen, yes?" asked the question. He looked at her directly. "Can I be there?" She set down her fork. The baby shifted, rolling, restless in the way that had become familiar. She put her hand on her side instinctively, and Owen's eyes followed the gesture and then came back to her face. "Why?" she asked. Not a challenge. She genuinely wanted to know. He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't reach for the first easy answer. "Because I don't want you to be alone in that room," he said finally. "And because I know you're capable of everything without me. I know that. But I'd like to be there if you'll let me." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the parking lot, the grocery bag, the book about infrastructure with the note tucked inside. She thought about 11 seconds and a signature and how wrong she'd been about what strength looked like. "My sister will be there," she said. "That's fine." "It won't be." She stopped. Started again. "It might be messy and long, and Veronica." He said her name gently. "I'm not going anywhere." She believed him. That was the thing. Standing at 39 years old, 37 weeks pregnant, surrounded by half-assembled baby furniture and Thai takeout containers, she believed him, and it was the simplest and most terrifying thing she'd felt in years. "Okay," she said. They were twin girls. The labor was 18 hours, the last 4 of which Veronica would later describe as something she could only survive by focusing on one breath and then the next, refusing to look at anything further ahead than the next 10 seconds. Her sister held her left hand and talked to her in a low, steady voice about absolutely nothing. The weather, a show she was watching, the new coffee shop on Roncesvalles. And Owen stood on her right and didn't say very much at all, which turned out to be exactly right. When the first baby arrived, Veronica heard herself make a sound she'd never made before and didn't have a name for. And then, 4 minutes later, the second, and the room went quiet for just a moment, before both babies announced themselves simultaneously, and her sister burst into tears, and Owen laughed. A real, surprised, genuine laugh. And Veronica held both of them, one in each arm, and for the first time in longer than she could measure, she wasn't thinking about anything at all. No clause, no courtroom, no 14 years, no narrative. Just this. Just these 2 small, furious, perfect faces. Their names came to her immediately, which surprised her. She'd been making lists for weeks, but when she looked at them she knew. The first was Charlotte, and the second was June. Charlotte and June Marsh. Elliot arrived at the hospital 6 hours later. Patricia had anticipated this and had already filed the necessary documentation with the hospital's legal team. Veronica had sole decision-making authority. Elliot had no parental rights established under the current proceedings, and any access request would need to go through the family court process already underway. She was told he'd appeared at the maternity ward reception desk, accompanied by his own lawyer. She was told he'd raised his voice. She was told he'd been escorted out by security. She didn't see any of it. She was in her room with Charlotte and June, learning how to hold two babies at once, which was harder and more natural than she'd expected. Her sister was asleep in the chair by the window. Owen had gone home to sleep a few hours and promised to be back in the morning with coffee and whatever she wanted from the bakery on Dundas. She looked at her daughters and thought, they will never know what it cost to be here. That was the point. That was always the point. The family court process took 4 months. What emerged by the end of it was not a dramatic confrontation. Real justice rarely looks like the movies. What it looked like was a judge reviewing the forensic document evidence about the altered clause, the timeline of Veronica's voluntary disclosure of the pregnancy to Elliot, the text messages and emails that established Elliot had known about the pregnancy before his legal team filed the parental rights declaration, and deciding clearly and on the record that the behavior of Elliot's legal team had been at minimum reckless and potentially fraudulent, and that the altered clause was inadmissible. Veronica was granted sole custody. Supervised access was available to Elliot, through a structured process if he chose to pursue it appropriately and in good faith. He chose not to, initially. His legal team was consumed with the securities investigation, which had grown considerably in scope. Cassandra Vane's name had appeared in some of the regulatory documentation. Werner Blackwood had given a deposition. The firm Elliot had spent 20 years building was restructuring. She read about it in pieces over months, the way you follow a story you're adjacent to but no longer inside. She felt the same tired sadness she'd felt when she first saw his name in the Globe. She didn't feel triumph. She wasn't sure she'd wanted this, any of it. She'd wanted a different life than the one she got. And instead she'd found her way to this one, which was turning out to be something she hadn't known how to want. Charlotte and June were 4 months old on the evening. Owen came over for dinner, and they sat on the floor of the living room, while the babies lay on a play mat between them, batting at dangling shapes with the uncoordinated enthusiasms of people who've just discovered they have hands. Owen was holding a board book, one of those stiff-paged ones with high-contrast pictures, and reading it aloud with great seriousness as if the content mattered. This is a fish. This is a very blue fish. Charlotte appeared to be listening with tremendous focus. June had fallen asleep with her fist against her cheek. Veronica watched him and thought about the community meeting in the church basement, the honest smile, the folder of research he'd brought because he cared. She thought about the grocery bag, the book, the note. Chapter 7 is the most useful one, I think. Owen, she said. He looked up. The evening light was coming in sideways through the window, the same window where she used to stand alone eating dinner because sitting at a table felt like an admission. She sat at the table now. She sat at the table every night. I want to say something, she said. And I need you to just let me say it without interrupting. Okay, he said, like always. I spent 14 years making myself smaller, she said. I got very good at it. And then my life fell apart and I actually thought for a while that the worst thing had happened. And then those two showed up. She nodded at the babies. And then you did. And I'm still figuring out what I am now, who I am now. I don't have that sorted. But I know. She stopped. Found the words. I know that I don't want to make myself small anymore. Not for anyone. Not even for you. And I know that you've never once asked me to. Owen was quiet for a moment. Charlotte grabbed his finger with her whole fist, and he looked down at her briefly, then back at Veronica. I know, he said. That's who you are. I didn't fall for the smaller version. She looked at him. This man who read board books with tremendous seriousness on her living room floor, who had stood on her right side for 18 hours and said very little, but meant everything. Good, she said. And then, because it was true and it had been true for a while, and she was done saying things smaller than she meant them. I love you. He smiled. The honest one, not the charming one. I love you too, he said. I have for a while. Outside the city went about its evening. The streetcar ran its line up Dundas. Someone's dog barked twice. The light faded, and inside, two small people on a playmat continued their very serious investigations into the nature of dangling shapes. And Veronica Marsh sat on the floor of her own life and found, against all the odds she'd been given, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be.